I think this is the greatest bill in the world because there's enough argument over what the provisions mean that you're going to make a lot of money arguing the provisions. That's troubling, though, because I think that the government would want to have a bill that is absolutely clear in its intentions, because then even if, listen, you're still going to, doesn't matter what bill you bring in, there's going to be people that have trouble with it. It could be on anything. But the fact of the matter is, if the bill is absolutely clear on what it is intended to do and what it does do, then you don't spend your whole time arguing in courts. You can argue in the court of public opinion, but you're not going to be arguing with lawyers in court over the meaning, and the meaning of two words here, whether the preamble has an effect or whether the preamble doesn't have an effect. That strikes me as a very, very difficult position for the government to put itself in, and that's really troubling. It bothers me that I'm really, really concerned, Mr. Chair, that this act to create this unified labour board, that there's suddenly this very panicked rush to get this through. And I don't know why, and the Premier won't explain why. He says it's housekeeping, but if it's housekeeping, there's no need to push it through. There's no need to suddenly take this bill and just get it through at all costs and set whatever's necessary and go through. You would think that the Premier and the Cabinet would be deeply concerned that people don't understand necessarily what effect the provisions have. I mean, the Minister and the Premier have both stated that there are myths associated with this, and perhaps there are, and perhaps people do have it wrong. But then why wouldn't you want to get them on side before you pass it? Because from a purely optics point of view, the situation the government has created sets up a situation where, regardless of what happens, if this gets passed this week or next week or Christmas Eve or whatever the case may be, that incidentally, thanks for putting the tree in, so I have somewhere to put my gifts if we're here Christmas Eve. But whether this gets passed this week, next week, or Christmas Eve, there are people that are going to be very angry at the government. And if the Premier and the Minister are correct that they're angry for the wrong reasons, then why wouldn't you want to correct that and fix that? Put the bill on hold, because if it's a housekeeping bill, there's no rush. There's no rush. And that's what's making people more and more concerned and having a bit of distrust over the issue, is that they're saying, well, if it is housekeeping, and if you're concerned that we're misunderstanding it, why are you pushing and pushing and pushing to get this through so fast? And why? I don't know whether, I have to imagine the situation in the Department of Labour Workforce Development. My assumption is what happened is that the department came forward with a bill to create this unified labour board. It was consulted on, people were talked to, and there was a lot of support. And so we have the bill and its title, an act to, I believe I don't have it right in front of me, but an act to create a unified labour board or something along those lines. And so it's great. And then somebody in the department said, oh, but we have to get through these other couple of things and get these done, whether we had promised them to somebody or we just think that's what we should do. It doesn't really matter why they got there, and said, do we have a bill that we could just get these in? And they were thrown in at the end. But that should be troubling, because it was the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal that stood up not last week and said that, and this isn't an omnibus bill, because an omnibus bill would have a different title, but it was the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal that stood up last week and said that he complained many times about there being different issues in a bill, and that bills, the reason that he was bringing so many short bills forward is because he thought every bill should deal with one issue. And I made the argument, well, they should deal with one issue, but if you have a bunch of things that are, and you say it's an act to amend the Motor Vehicle Act, then fine, you can put those together. But in this case, you have an act that the title says its specific purpose is only to create a unified labour board and do nothing else. Do nothing else. And yet it isn't until you get down to the intricacies at the end. And to make it even worse, when you get down, there isn't even, the bill doesn't even have explanatory notes to say what these provisions are doing. And they in fact amend other acts. And unless you go read the other acts, you don't even know what the impact of that would be. And I don't believe that there was something underhanded, but I do believe that there's something funny when, the one hand, there are government ministers saying that things shouldn't be, hidden in bills, and you shouldn't include things in bills that don't relate to the title, when in this case, the successor rights, the management committee, neither of those issues actually have anything to do with creating a unified labor board. They really don't, and that's troubling, Mr. Speaker. Really, this should be titled "An Act Respecting Certain Labor Issues." It is, there are, when we look at even the construction issues, and there may be good reasons for this, but this is another one that was sort of thrown in as maybe a housekeeping amendment, and maybe it has no impact, but you look at Section 150, I think it might still be Section 150, which requires employers, associations to pay all the dues for construction projects. And maybe that was a result of an issue where people weren't paying dues, but the interesting thing is that does that mean an open shop contractor has to pay union dues? Well, it's not clear, and there's some people in the construction industry saying it does, and there's some saying that it doesn't. But it's not clear. So why wouldn't that provision have a further line explaining exactly what the intent of that is? When we look at, and Mr. Speaker or Mr. Chair, it really comes down to the issue of consultation. The reason that nobody is out there writing letters or expressing concern about the actual unified board is because they were consulted. They understand what it means. We all get that there's a bunch of boards that deal with labor issues that are going to be merged into one, which will hopefully streamline administration, which will, I think one of the department staff said it won't necessarily save costs, but it's about streamlining, and sometimes that can result in efficiencies, and maybe there will be some savings, but the job's been posted, so let's get that part done. Let's strip the other provisions, get this done, because that, I mean, if that's what the rush is, if that truly is what the rush is, let's get that done. We can, stop this game of trying to get the government to explain what the provisions are, or to clarify provisions, or strip those provisions by having to be here now, have everybody get up and stand, by just getting that done, and we can then deal with the concerns that people have. It would allow the minister to get on with creating that unified board, and in fact, then what would happen is that when we look at things like creating a committee, we can have a debate on that, or the minister can consider the many comments that I know she's received and that have come in since. Because why are we saying that none of these people matter? And the member for Halifax Fairview did this in the fall, or maybe it was the spring, when he suggested that the CFIB should get rid of their leadership because I can't remember the exact quote, but he said they should get rid of their leadership because they complain all the time. I tabled the article here the other day. Well, then a couple weeks ago, when he had another provision, he said, look, the CFIB supports this. Well, now the CFIB is coming out and they're concerned about it and want this provision stripped, and all of a sudden they're the bad guys again. Well, you don't have to agree with them, but why wouldn't you respect them instead of attacking them every time that they say something that you disagree with, and then, trumpeting them every time they say something when they agree with you? Just respect their opinions. There are organizations, there are plenty of organizations in Canada and elsewhere that I may not agree with, I'm not a big fan of the Tea Party in the US, but I still respect the fact that they have a right to have their opinion and have it heard and have it said. And you know, that their issues, many of them deserve consideration, whether I agree with them or not. You know, I really think that this is a case where the government has decided it is not willing to listen to the concerns, and they may very well make a mistake here, because these provisions could end up being something that is far more troublesome and far more problematic than even the government believes. And you would think, Mr. Speaker, that when Labour lawyers line up on different sides of this issue at law amendments and interpret the bill differently, and when in fact that the very people who are called there to support the bill on behalf of the government interpret the bill different than the government, you would think that would be considered problematic. That the government would look at that and say, okay, that in fact what we need to do is we need to make sure that everybody understands what this bill does. And that can be achieved in many ways. That can be achieved by, you know, if the government is determined to get this bill through now, then it can be achieved through amendments. If the government is willing to listen and step back, and if it truly is housekeeping these provisions, then they would be willing to strip the provisions other than the Unified Labour Board and allow the Unified Labour Board section to pass, and then we'll work on the other parts, and you know, we will make sure that people can agree reasonably, or for the most part, on at least what things like successor rights in these committees are supposed to do. But nobody can say in this House that Labour Review Committee would not affect non-union employers, because it does. Of course it does. It either affects you now or in the future when you may be unionized. Of course it does. And I repeat the fact the Premier did very little, nothing in fact, to clear that issue up when he would not rule out card check certification, which the union hero J.B. McLaughlin fought so hard against and said that unionization had to be the basis, be done based on democratic principles. That's why he fought the United Mine Workers of America at the time and formed his own thing, was because his basic principle, he wanted better rights. He wanted people to have living wages. He wanted people to have the rights and the benefits that they needed, and safe working conditions and all those things. But he said at every one, and there's quote after quote after quote by him talking about how unionization had to be done based on democratic principles, and I challenge anybody to tell me how anything but a secret ballot is democratic principles. And if it is, then let's go out and have the next provincial election by the same rules, because you know, I can't imagine there'd be anybody in here that would suggest that an election should be held by anything but a secret ballot. My goodness, well, we would never suggest that. And the Premier wouldn't rule it out. And the problem is, and I have no idea, to be perfectly honest, whether the Premier thinks that card check is a good idea or bad idea. I have no idea. But by not ruling it out, it just fed into the concerns that exist, either rightly or incorrectly, over the impacts that this bill could have. And that's what this is really all about, is the concern that the government is doing very little to alleviate the deepest concerns that members of the public have raised. The fact is, in sort of wrapping up here, Nova Scotia has a lot of very valuable unionized workplaces. And it has a lot of very valuable non-unionized workplaces too. And both of those, there are examples in both of those where they work very effectively. And where they all contribute to society, and they all contribute to the environment in which we live, and they are all going to contribute to the future economic growth and prosperity of this province and this region. And there are places where employees decide that unions make sense, and there are places where employees decide that unions don't make sense. There are places in this province where employees choose to become basically part of management and have ownership in the company. But there are many of those groups and organizations like that that are concerned by the interpretation by some on both sides of the issue around things like successor rights that they may left out. There are people in both of those types of workplaces who are deeply concerned about what changes may come as a result of a committee that is only required to consult with non-union employers and employees, but does not require them to have them as full members involved in the committee. And there is a difference between being in a town hall meeting and being a voice of a few hundred and being on a committee. There is a big difference. It means something when you are on the committee. It means that you are respected. It means that your position will be heard, and even if you don't get the ability to say the things or the ability to have your view in that final committee report, you have the option to have a dissenting report. You have the option to make sure that the individuals on that committee have heard you and that you are recognized by the government as equal. The current structure, as proposed in this bill, of the Labour Review Committee does nothing to ensure that non-union and union employers and employees are treated equally and fairly. It furthers divisions, and that is not the type of legislation that we should be hoping for. It is not the type of legislation we should be hoping for, and it is not the type of province that we should aspire to. We should aspire to a province where people are treated equally, are given choice in their employment situations, where they're given choice in whether they unionize or they don't unionize, where every employer and employee has the equal right to bid on tenders from this province and bid on work from this province, that every employer and employee in this province is given a chance to succeed. Because let's not forget the fact that, as I said earlier, at Law Amendments Committee, it was the government's own supporters that said that that isn't what would happen. It was some of the government's own supporters that said that would be removed. So the government can say that it's a myth, but there were more than one presenter at that committee there to support it that said that is exactly what this bill does, and that's why they were supporting it. And that, Mr. Speaker, should be concerned. And the fact that the government will not put an amendment in the bill that clarifies that, as the leader of the Conservative Party suggested and as others have suggested, just points to the fact that they must be true, that they must be correct in their interpretation of the bill, because otherwise you would put that amendment in to clear that up. You wouldn't, as a government, you wouldn't want that misinformation to be out there. You wouldn't want that myth to be perpetuated, and the way to get rid of that is, in fact, to remove that. Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chair, it troubles me that, we have to be here discussing a bill that is already creating divisions in different sectors of the economy. It troubles me that, a group of 20-ish organizations representing thousands of workers writes the Premier today, and they feel as though they're blown off when that letter arrives. And in fact, the quote already in the media reports is that Premier dismisses the concerns. Well, you know what? The government, whether they agree with the concerns or not, should never dismiss concerns. Government has every right to disagree with its critics, and government has every right and every ability to decide that they don't agree with the positions of their critics. But government should never have the right to dismiss their critics or dismiss those that raise concerns. Because the fact of the matter is, this government wouldn't be here if they hadn't listened to concerns of people over the years. And so to now get into government and ignore that is an affront to those very people who put them here, saying that we're putting you here because we think you'll listen. We may not always agree to you, but we think you'll listen. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, we're suddenly hearing from people who would never have supported either our party or the Conservative Party, who are saying, listen, this wasn't the government that I thought it was going to be. And Mr. Speaker, it really comes down to being open and listening and being different in that respect. And Mr. Speaker, that should be troubling when, 82% of the private sector employees and 70% of all employees in Nova Scotia are in a group represented by many of these organizations that have written a letter to the Premier today and say that they feel disenfranchised by this legislation and they feel left out. They feel left out. And when it comes to the other issue, and that's an easy fix. It's an easy fix, Mr. Speaker, and I don't know why the government wouldn't put members of those groups on this Labour Review Committee, because it does affect them, and they even point out in the letter how it affects them. So, Mr. Speaker, there is a choice. There is a choice for the government, and I know that all parties here would support moving this unified Labour Board forward, and would be happy to support that provision. And let's send those other provisions back to consultation so that at least we can come to this House with people agreeing on what they mean, and without having to have a debate over whether it means one extreme or the other or somewhere in the middle. And that's really what this comes down to, is this legislature deserves the respect of having everybody understand and at least agree what the stated principle of the legislation is. And Mr. Speaker, the government seems to even be unwilling to move amendments which would clarify some of those provisions, so they should strip them out and allow consultation to continue on those and move forward with simply the Unified Labour Board. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I will now recognize the honourable member for Inverness.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Please tell me you share our concern.
420 was the over 30.
That was the title of an email I received from a business owner in Inverness County on the weekend. And this is a gentleman whose family business has been in business for over 25 years and has been a supplier in the past to government. And he fears that this legislation will forever change the way he does business with government in Nova Scotia. Are his fears unfounded? Well, he is not convinced of that, and perhaps if there was better consultation before this bill was put before this House, there would not be so many people in this province concerned about it. And will this owner have to pay union wages, benefits, and pension benefits if he wants to bid on government contracts? Well, right now, that's what's considered out there. There's a lot of educated people out there. There's a lot of lawyers out there who have read this legislation and have given their interpretation to it. And sometimes these things end up having to get fought about in court, Mr. Chair, but the point is, there's a lot of people who have read this who are disturbed by it. And could we see fewer suppliers for government services? Well, if people are afraid to bid on contracts for fear that there are successor rights that would extend to their employees, which would drive up their costs of operations, and not just for that contract, but for all work they do from that point onward, they may decide not to bother bidding on a tender. And if that's the case, Mr. Chair, fewer bidders, what happens when you have less supply for the services of government? Prices go up. And that is not going to be good for this province. We all know how much tax we pay already. We pay some of the highest taxes in North America. Our HST is the highest in Canada. And I know the finance minister likes to say that it's not, because the nominal rate in PEI is a teaspoon higher at 0.5%, but essentially we're paying the highest rate in Canada. And if we look at other jurisdictions, people are not paying near that kind of sales tax. But I look at some other things, like Bill 100, will it make it more difficult to actually transfer functions currently performed by public employees? Will it be less interest? Will public employers be less interested in taking over or acquiring these functions or taking on employees because of the associated benefit costs? That's a possibility. Bill 100 does not make it clear whether or not open shop contractors will be required to pay union dues. There is another NDP-governed jurisdiction that has this, and we feel this point needs to be clarified. In summary, if, as the government suggests, this bill really changes nothing in terms of contracting our processes, then why is it necessary to enshrine something that already happens automatically in a new law? So, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, I do know that there have been times in the past when there's been a need for greater balance between the employee and the employer. And I think of the honourable member from Dartmouth North, who was speaking here earlier today, Dartmouth East, sorry, who was speaking here just moments ago, and he referenced J.B. McLaughlin, a great labour leader, and someone who made many personal sacrifices to try to draw attention to the inequity of labour relations at the time, and the fact that most people who were working in the province, especially if they're working in primary industries like mining, were working in an environment where they didn't have many rights. And I think if you look at all from their pay and to how their pay was calculated, it was a very unfair set of circumstances. And I remember reading the book, The Company Store, and learning about how when people would be bringing up their coal, their work for the day, how the scales in some cases were not set up appropriately. They were set up to gyp the workers of the work that they did that day. And that's a shameful practice. And it highlighted at the time the power of business and the corruption of government. And, you know, Mr. Chair, people in a lot of cases, if you look at this, they're really treated like dirt. They worked hard. They were crouched down, deep down under the earth, digging for coal, putting in an honest day's work, and they weren't getting paid a fair day's wage. They were controlled. Things that they bought it from the company store. And so all the funds that were generated from the mining activity were always funneled back into the pockets of the company. And this is too much control. It's certainly not capitalism. It's more akin to a dictatorship where everybody is controlled. There's no real free market there. And at that time, unions played a great role in helping those people. And no one else was looking out for the common good of those people. And, you know, education was a big factor too. It wasn't so easy to get well educated in those days. And if people, and also the economy certainly wasn't nearly as developed as you see it today. There are many options for people today to find careers. You can travel, but back then that wasn't the case. And it highlights the importance of the need for balance. And a good friend of mine who many of you would know, Cyril Reddy, who's somebody I used to have a daily conversation with. I enjoyed his company and I enjoyed his take on things. And I remember him telling me, and I believe he was a former president of the NSGEU, I remember him telling me, Alan, there needs to be a balance. And sometimes, no matter what people's intentions are, sometimes there can be imbalance because people can become perhaps overzealous with their side of the ledger, and there needs to be balance, and there needs to be. So, I thought that made a lot of sense, and it makes you step back and realize that it's important to be looking at all sides of the equation. I look at another area where the unions have helped. I remember asking my father about his time spent working on the railway when he worked for CNR. And they used to work 6 days a week. And I know he was very busy because he'd be probably playing at dances another 2 or 3 days of the week. And so he was going nonstop. So when we moved from 6-day work weeks to 5-day work weeks, it made life a lot easier for people and for families. And so that was an achievement. And we recognize the social value that brings to society and the value that brings to families, for people to have more time to spend together as a family. And so there's great value in that. So what does all this have to do with Bill 100? Well, we do know that the aim of this bill is to merge 6 labor boards into one. And that certainly seems like a sensible thing to do. We're not talking about weighing coal here or establishing a balance necessarily, or ensuring people are working 5 days as opposed to 6 days. But the small business community in the private sector of Nova Scotia, and that's a sector that exists in each one of our 52 constituencies. We all have people in our ridings, in our constituencies, who are going to be looking in the next election to see who is there looking out for our interests. Is there a balance? And they're going to be looking at things like Bill 100 to see, is this make sense for Nova Scotia? Of course, they'll be looking at their own personal perspectives, and thankfully they do, Mr. Chair, because we need business to be healthy in the province. We need businesses that are generating profits, because when they are, that might mean they might be able to hire additional people. And with an unemployment rate around 9%, there's lots of people in this province that would benefit from having an opportunity to find employment. These people in our constituents are also going to be saying, well, what about the education system? What about what's been going on with school boards? They've been reducing budgets for school boards, and they're going to be asking themselves, is government optimizing the resources that we're giving them when we pay our taxes? You know, because when government doesn't optimize resources, there's going to be consequences. And if this legislation causes the value of services to go up and the cost for government to go up because there are fewer people interested in bidding on government contracts, well, that means there's going to be less dollars for all the other things that we need. And education is just one example of many, but it's certainly one that's relevant across the province, as this government has asked school boards to make cuts to the tune of, I believe it's about 22% over the next 3 years. So it's significant, Mr. Chair, and it highlights the importance when we're looking at things like Bill 100. Is there the potential to cost government more money and pull more resources away from, say, the classroom? So back to this small business community in the private sector, which is 70% of people in this province who they work for. It affects all of those people. These people weren't consulted on the clauses that are now a topic of hot debate in this province. And there was a discussion paper from government in July of 2010, but Mr. Chair, if we look at that discussion paper, we'll see no mention of successor rights or a labor management review committee or the need for companies to post bonds when appealing a decision. Now, well, maybe these small businesses, maybe these people who are in every one of our 52 constituencies, maybe these people are overreacting to this legislation. But if we look at, in Manitoba, the Labour Management Review Committee, let's look at some of the things they've done. There have been changes made to overtime hours and exemptions. This committee has introduced new unpaid leave days. They've improved statutory holiday pay. They've put new rules in place for termination notices. They've increased fines for businesses that are considered repeat non-compliance offenders. Now, granted, some of these things are, may have legitimacy. But we can certainly not argue about the fact that they're all going to affect employers. They're going to affect private business in our province, people that provide 70% of the jobs in this province. But yet these people, who these very things will affect, have no say in these matters. They don't even have, because they're not included on the Management Review Committee, and they're not going to be asked whether or not they think these things are good or not. They might even think they're good, but they won't have the chance, Mr. Chair, to express that because they're not even included. And 70% of the people working in this province, their employers, are not included. That's imbalance. That's not the balance we talked about when I spoke earlier about the company store and the times when people in this province were treated very poorly. People working in mines, And no doubt we all have ancestors and relatives who worked in the mines. There wasn't much else to do in many parts of this province and across the country but to go to work in mines. So we've seen achievements towards greater balance. But this legislation doesn't give balance to the 70% of employers, 70% of employees in this province, the people who work for private business. Now, if we want to go back and look, perhaps once again, maybe these employers and these people maybe they shouldn't be overreacting to this legislation, but if we look at the past record of some members of this government in this legislature, we can look at a number of bills that would affect the way businesses is done in this province. And legislation, this stuff is important because if we're affecting our economy, we're affecting tax revenues for government. We're affecting people whether or not they have employment. We're affecting the competitive structure of our province relative to other jurisdictions we're competing with. And we're competing with them because we want to provide Nova Scotians with a good standard of living. And Mr. Chair, there's nothing shameful about trying to be competitive and about trying to provide Nova Scotians with employment opportunities and so that people have dignity. Because with work, people have dignity. They get dignity. We want people to have opportunities. Now, some of this legislation, I look at back in 1998, a bill number 59, an amendment to the Trade Union Act. Description, this bill provides for collective bargaining successor rights. So we see successor rights in Bill 100. And the purpose in this case of successor rights was the bill provides for collective bargaining successor rights upon A, the transfer of employees of the Crown to another employer. Which is precisely what small businesses in this province are worried about. If they bid on a government contract and they're successful, and they get the contract, if successor rights extend the privileges and the benefits of the employers who were previously working on these projects, then these companies now have to extend those successor rights to their employees. B, the transfer of a business from federal to provincial jurisdiction. C, the transfer of a business to a receiver who continues to operate the business. Or D, the transfer of a contract for services. And E, the issuance of a franchise. So it's all about successor rights. It's about a member of this legislature who's still sitting here today on the government side who was trying to amend the Trade Union Act with Bill 59. And the attempt was to provide successor rights. Now, perhaps he'll enlighten us as to what his goals were at some point at a future opportunity. But if the goal was to extend these rights out into the private sector, then that's exactly why I got that email on the weekend from a gentleman who runs a business in my area, and he said the title of his email was, "Please tell me you share our concern," because he's concerned, Mr. Chair. So we have this Bill 100 before us, and we've seen the past record of some government members of this House. And does this man have a reason to be concerned? Well, maybe he does. We look at Bill 53, introduced in 2001 by a member of the government side, which would lead to higher wage costs. And what happens when we have higher wage costs, Mr. Chair? Oftentimes it results in fewer jobs. And unfortunately, a lot of the trying to search for a better word, but a lot of the minutia really gets boiled out of these kinds of things when the rubber hits the road, Mr. Chair. If we're competing with other areas, it's just the same, no different in business. If a business is competing against another business and its costs are going up, well, the consumer, which is all of us, we all shop at places like anywhere you shop. People are often looking for deals. They're watching the flyers, they're looking for a deal. If they can get something at a better price, they're going to buy it at the better price. And that's just human nature, Mr. Chair. And if government is causing the cost of goods to go up, perhaps it's through here with successor rights, increasing the wages and benefits for private sector, that means the cost of service is going to go up. We're going to be able to enjoy fewer services because we don't have as much money to pay for them. So there's for every action, there's an equal opposite reaction. And as I say, Mr. Chair, when the rubber hits the road, the mystery comes out of it, the minutia comes out of it, and people buy the cheapest good available. And this is reality. And if this legislation causes that to happen, Mr. Chair, we're going to see this province have less dollars available for the goods and services that it procures, because there'll be fewer people willing to bid on contracts. And, you know, with Bill 53, with this bill back in 2001, we're also going to see changes made to vacation pay to double it. And it's just one example that's driving up costs. And while, yes, in the short term and on the surface, that may appear good for employees, they're going to get a little boost in their vacation pay. What happens, Mr. Chair, if that kind of legislation took effect, drives up the cost of a business, and the business can't afford to have as many employees? Somebody's out in the cold. Some Nova Scotian is out in the cold. And I don't think that's something that any member in this House would want to be championing. And so if we're looking at things like that in Bill 100, Mr. Chair, that's not something that I want to champion. If we look at, Mr. Chair, how much time, Mr. Chair? How much time do I have remaining?
You would approximately have 40 minutes. You have 20 gone already. 4:20 was your start time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome.
Well, it's, you know what, Mr. Chair, I don't have any problem. I've got a lot of material here, and I do know that there's merit to it. There's logic to it. And I hope that the members opposite are digesting it. And perhaps if maybe only a kernel comes through, then I think the time is worth spending speaking about it. So, Mr. Chair, we look at Bill 60, introduced back in 2001. Once again, looking at how this relates to Bill 100. Past legislation offered up, and what was the intent of it, Mr. Chair? Because that's what we're discussing today. What was the intent of Bill 100 here? And when we look at this bill, there were a couple of clauses back in 2001. And Clause 1 provided that a trade union claiming to have as members in good standing more than 50% of the employees in a unit appropriate for collective bargaining may apply to the Labour Relations Board certification, and the board may certify the union without holding a vote of employees. So this legislation was designed back in 2001 to allow a union to be formed without employees even having a chance to vote on it. Not much transparent about that. Limiting the rights of people to have a say on whether or not they want to be unionized. There are many people in this province who belong to unions who don't want to belong to them, Mr. Chair, but they don't have a choice. We have, you know, so if we look at successor rights, if we look at people's ability to become unionized, and removing a vote to be unionized and just saying, okay, we've got the majority, let's not even have a vote, let's not even have a campaign on this. Mr. Chair, that shows an intent by the member that introduced that Bill 60 back in 2001 to try to subvert the rights of the other employees who might not have been in favor of that. Subverting those rights to the point that employees wouldn't even have a chance to hear what the vote would have been about, that the decision would be made for them. And Mr. Chair, that's certainly not about democracy, but that intent shines through today in Bill 100, and we worry, well, are these some of the things that are going on in the minds of the government? Are these some of the things that people are going to have to fear? And which, you know, back to the gentleman that wrote me the email, the business owner, he says, do you share our concerns? And yes, Mr. Chair, I do. Because if we just simply lay down and let legislation pass through this House without questioning it, and it has a negative effect on the 70% of people that are employed in this province in private business, then we have not done our job as opposition, and we've just allowed something to happen in government without even questioning it that may be hurting our economy, which has affects us all, affects people who aren't even working, because affects young people going to school, because so many people depend on government and the services government provides and the need for government to provide those services efficiently. So, and I have to look at Bill 60 was tried again in 2005, and it was Bill 220 this time. And same thing, the bill was providing that a trade union claiming to have as members in good standing more than 60%, it was up from 50 to 60 this time. This would have been the Deputy Premier, our Deputy Premier today, who introduced this, both times. And the bill was provide that a trade union claiming to have members in good standing more than 60% of employees in a unit appropriate for collective bargaining may apply to the Labour Relations Board for certification, and the board may certify the union without holding a vote of the employees. So the intent by that member at that time was to say, I don't care what some people think who might be working for that organization. If we've got 60% of the people saying they want a union, we're going to have it without even discussing it. So, Mr. Chair, when you have intent like that in this House in opposition, one wonders what the intent might be when in government, when in majority government, when the only thing that can happen in this House to slow that down, to slow Bill 100 down, is the opposition members filibustering and the opposition members taking their time, taking their privilege in this House to speak on these matters, to draw concern so that Nova Scotians have time and the media has time to talk about these things, so Nova Scotians have a chance, because Nova Scotians deserve to look at these things and determine for themselves, Mr. Chair. And that's why we're here talking about this. And they'll have their say, Mr. Chair. They don't get to have it like we do in this chamber, but they'll get to have their say when they mark their X in the next election. So these are reasons, some of the reasons why I believe, Mr. Chair, that small business is concerned about Bill 100. And we need these people in our province. One, because they employ 70% of people working in our province, but also because the private sector drives our economy. And, if we look at other countries in the world, if we look at other economic trends, and we consider Bill 100 and its potential impact, I spoke recently, Mr. Chair, in this House about the investment community and the investment money flowing to countries that, countries where, and I'll quote here from, their public employees aren't paid more than their private sector earns, they don't retire young, their governments are not laden with debts that can only be serviced with economic growth at unachievable levels. And what's being spoken about here is countries like China and India. They don't have the legacy that we have. They don't have the conditions that we have in this province. And Mr. Chair, if we want to have a good economy, we should be paying attention to this, because where the money flows, so goes prosperity of provinces, of nations. And if we have, through government here, we play a very important role. And through Bill 100, if we're setting up conditions that that make the private sector...
Order, please. There seems to be a lot of chatter this evening in the chamber on all sides of the House, so I'd like the matter to let the honourable member have the floor and make his point. Thank you very much. The honourable member for Inverness.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just to sum that point up, if with Bill 100, if we're changing conditions in our economy that are going to cause costs to rise, that's not good, Mr. Chair, because if we look at some of these other countries who are growing and who are attracting the attention of the investment community, where people want to invest, they don't have government employees earning more than the private sector, and governments laden with debts that can only be serviced with unachievable levels of growth. So And I know, Mr. Chair, that I spoke in this House recently about my travels to South Africa. And that country, while it's limited in how much it can borrow by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, the fact that it's actually a bit of a silver lining for them because they've borrowed less over time, and that less debt means less liability and potential for a healthier future. So, you know, if we look at Nova Scotia, how do we compare? Well, we've got a lot of debt here, and that's going to cause us to have a sluggish future. We're going to be slower moving. A lot of these countries don't have the standard of wealth that we have, but if you look at their future, maybe they have greater potential. They have a chance to assess what we've done here in the past, and they can make decisions about where they want to go, and they may not want to go in the direction we've gone, Mr. Chair. And you know, when we look at whether or not people should be concerned about Bill 100, you know, we look at the private sector that employs 70% of people in the province, and we do know that 1 in every 4 jobs in this province is a government job belonging to one of the levels of government. And I'm not going to go into the mathematical details of this too much, but if you had people earning an average government salary, if you had them in a tax bracket, average 30% tax bracket, you're looking at a need of about 2.3 private sector jobs to pay for every government job. And in this province, of course, as I just mentioned, we have 3 private sector jobs for every government job. So, Mr. Chair, this is a point of concern. It begs us to ask about the sustainability of government at its present size when we need 2.3 people to sustain every government job and we've only got 3. What happens if something happens in our economy, if our economy declines? We're almost at break-even point for being able to supply the need of government. Significant. Wouldn't it be better if we had 1 in 5 jobs in this province, Mr. Chair, as a government job? Because that would say that we have a stronger private sector, we have less reliance on government employment for people, and we've got more taxes coming from private sector development to support government. Maybe it gives government better cash flow, so we have more resources to spend, and I think the good example right now, Mr. Chair, is education with school boards. If there's more resources to spend in the classroom, perhaps it's all about priorities, Mr. Chair, and if we want money to be spent in the classroom as opposed to somewhere else in government, then it's all about decisions that we make right here in this legislature. And that goes back to Bill 100. So, you know, this government has focused on giving job security, and that's nice. It's, everybody in this province wants to have a secure employment. 70% of the people in the private sector don't have that. Their job security a lot of times relates directly back to their own effort when they go to work each day. These people live with another reality, Mr. Chair, and I sympathize with them. And I know it's important for people to have security. It's one of the most important things in life to have security, whether it's of income or of stability at home. But what are we doing? What are we trading away, Mr. Chair, when government gives that level of security? We certainly haven't seen organized labor in this province marching in the streets. They've been very quiet since this government's been elected. And I think in large part they're happy about the job security that's been offered to their members. And, you know, Mr. Chair, we talk about this government complains about what it has inherited, but it's done very little to change that so far. And we look at this, you know, 1 in 4 jobs in Nova Scotia is a government job. That puts pressure on taxation to keep taxes high, puts its thumb down on private sector development. I was drilling down the other day. I heard of a business that was leaving our province I'm not going to say which one, but I was, and this is secondhand knowledge, so I won't take away from that. Maybe it's not true, but I'll certainly mention it because I think it's relevant to mention, and that's because I said, well, why did they leave? And they said, well, they gave such and such a reason. I said, yeah, but what if we were able to get around that? So I kept drilling down, and finally the answer that was given to me, almost reluctantly, was, well, it's expensive to do business in Nova Scotia. And I thought, well, there's where the rubber hits the road, Mr. Chair. Everything we do in here, including Bill 100, impacts that. And when we only have 3 out of every 4 people in the province working in the private sector, it's not the sign of as healthy economy as we could have. And so giving job security to the other 25%, while it may be honorable, it handcuffs the government. It handcuffs this government to do something about the state of our debt. It handcuffs them in their ability to balance the budget. And I'm sure when the finance minister is talking to all his ministers, when it comes time for budget planning and trying to shave off a few dollars here in the departments, one of the things, Mr. Chair, and this government is no different. One of the things the government deals with when they are elected is most of the money is already spent for them. They come to office and money is pretty tight. There's not much free cash flow to be nimble. Contrast that with a company in private sector, Mr. Chair, and the need for companies to have free cash flow to be able to take new directions, to change, because their competitors might be changing. And if they're not changing, they're going to be out of business. So they have to stay dynamic. And this government is no different, Mr. Chair. They are faced with that. As soon as they come into office, they are faced with every department saying, you can't cut this, you can't change this, we need this. All the money is spent. It's very hard for governments to change the big ship of government. It's very hard to get a hand on that rudder and change the direction, because most people don't care. They're more concerned about their immediate, and that's no different of anybody, and that exists in the private sector, Mr. Chair. But I think that needs to be recognized, because that's the first step in doing something in government to change the state of our economy. And it relates back to Bill 100. These are the things we need to think about if we're going to pass this kind of legislation and how it might have impacts. So if we look at job security, that's really constricting government to do the kinds of things it needs to do to provide balanced budgets and to make, because I really, if you look at government, if you look at the biggest departments and the biggest expenditures, they're all wages. And there are certainly people working in government in important positions that we could never even look at because they're delivering essential services. And Nova Scotians need those people, and you wouldn't even be able to consider waving goodbye to those people. But to give job security to everybody, all it does, Mr. Chair, is it limits government's ability to make decisions going forward. And it's all about decisions, and it's not always pretty making decisions in government. But in the long run, hopefully people are remembered for their efforts. And sometimes in this business, Mr. Chair, you got to take some pain for long-term gain. And you know, we have in this province, we have you know, the Department of Health, and this is not unique to this government. It's in every province in the country, and it doesn't matter whether it's this government in power or another government in power. Right now, the rate of growth in health last year was almost 8%. And you know, Mr. Chair, if there's ways in the Department of Health that they can reduce that growing cost, so that at the end of the day, Mr. Chair, what we want to provide Nova Scotians with is good health care. That should be our #1 goal. But if we're going to place job security over the quality of health care, then, well, maybe we, you know, and with Bill 100, maybe we can't move services out to the private sector because maybe there's no need to, because maybe no money can be saved. So you know, maybe with Bill 100, we're constricting our ability with the Department of Health to get a containment of its costs. And you know, if you're an investor and you can get almost 8% on your money, you're going to double your money every 10 years. So if you got a couple $100,000, you turn it into $400,000 in a couple of years. Well, that's a good story, Mr. Chair. That's a success story. But if you're looking at the Department of Health and you're looking at the same rate of growth and you're going to double your Department of Health, and it's currently 45% of our expenditure in government, and you're going to have 90% of the budget spent on health, we've got big problems. And things like job security and extending that benefit, while yes, it's nice for people to have job security, what good is it, Mr. Chair, if we're going to destroy our province? And maybe destroy is a strong word, but if you have 90% of the budget allocated for health, it's not going to be too much for 5-year road plans. There's not going to be too much for education boards to deal with demands in the classroom of children who have things like allergies and diabetes, and children who are growing up with learning disabilities that we're able to recognize today that we weren't able to recognize 25 years ago. And Mr. Chair, this is all about decisions. And I think this government needs to start looking at these decisions, start considering what can we do differently? Is there a way we can save some money here and there? And I know I've been asked in the past, and it's been kind of thrown at me, well, where would you cut? Or, you know, a member from Inverness, what's going to happen in your area, you know? And, well, most of government is located in Halifax, so perhaps it's of lesser concern to me, and most people working for government in Inverness are on the front lines delivering services that are very real and pertinent for Nova Scotians. But, Mr. Chair, that kind of debate does nothing, because it only discourages people from trying to find solutions, because we have problems. We have problems when we have as much debt as we do. Because what does that debt mean? And people can say, oh, that's only debt. And all the other provinces have that debt too. Well, Mr. Chair, item 4, the 4th biggest expenditure of government is interest. Money that's thrown out the window because we have incurred debt in the past and we're stuck with it. That should be a real pain. It should be something that we're all feeling. It should motivate us. It should motivate us to want to do something. And with Bill 100, you know, if successor rights mean that the private sector can't deliver services to government because it's got to take on the same cost structures that government has to deliver those services, and there's no savings to government, well, that's a step in the wrong direction, Mr. Chair. And that's not going to do anything to help us whittle down that number 4 expenditure of interest. Because we're going to have harder time balancing the budget, we're going to incur more deficit budgets. That's certainly not about compassion, Mr. Chair. And I think members of all parties of this House have compassion. I think we all run for office wanting to help Nova Scotians. And if this bill is driving up costs for government potentially in the future, or inhibiting government from saving money, so that we can better optimize resources for, say, children in a classroom, then, Mr. Chair, I certainly am not going to vote for this bill. And the reason that we're up here speaking for so long is because we want the government to understand that. And we want the members opposite to rethink this legislation. And if these clauses are causing the level of concern that they are, why not remove them now, have consultation, have some certainty out there that we're not handcuffing government in the future to save money, and bring it back again, Mr. Chair. Instead, if the members opposite don't listen to that advice and they decide we're just going to put this through and it causes these effects, well, we're not doing our province any favor. And we're not being compassionate in the sense that we're handcuffing government. We are eliminating future potential cost savings, which all that's doing, Mr. Chair, is while it might be providing security for somebody in their job, it's not going to provide parents who have children in school with the best resources, with optimized resources, so that they know that their children are getting the best possible education they can get right here in Nova Scotia. So this is going to have to take leadership, Mr. Chair, and we need this government to start doing something. They've done very little to balance efforts to balance the books. They've increased taxes. We need a government that's going to manage costs in government. And we need a government that's going to make some tough decisions. And we look at a man in this province, and I know at the time there were a lot of people unhappy with him, Dr. John Ham. And I remember the clinking of the grate outside of this province house, Mr. Chair, from people who were protesting decisions being made by that government at that time. And they were tough decisions. And you know what, Mr. Chair, nobody enjoys making tough decisions like that. But they led to our province having the first balanced budget in 40 years. And you know what? Those tough decisions made for a lot of good things. And it allowed the province to be more compassionate, to be able to do more things, because it was freeing up cash flow, freeing up money away from things, from debt, freeing up money that would have went into interest payments on debt, and putting them where Nova Scotians, putting that money, Nova Scotians' money, paid through their taxes, putting that money to work for them, not on debt, but on their priorities. So government has to make decisions. It has to make tough decisions. We look at the 1980s, there was a lot of spending was going on, and we can try to cast blame on a particular party, Mr. Chair, but I don't see any value in that. If we look back, one could say we were all guilty. If we look at the federal government at the time, they were spending with reckless abandon, and a lot of their spending required the province to partner in that expenditure. And we had in this province, of course, we had Cisco and Devco, which was consuming a tremendous amount of money, responsible for 1/4 of our provincial debt, Mr. Chair. 1/4 of our provincial debt was money spent on Cisco and Devco. There was cooperation at both levels of government. There were rail orders being put in by the CN when it was a Crown Corp, so that the steel plant would have orders to keep moving. And you know what? That is a perfect example of government trying to help people, much like this NDP government is trying to help people by giving them job security. But Mr. Chair, where did that lead our province? Well, today we have 25% of our debt is as a result of Cisco and Devco. 25%. 25%. Well, we can, and you know what, I know I heard the figure in the past, and it was probably about 8 years ago, and I'll be happy to dig it up. But 25% of the debt of the province came from that operation. And Mr. Chair, today, what does that mean for us today? Well, we had the compassion of governments at the time of trying to offer job security, much like this government is trying to do today. But think about it. The fourth biggest line of expenditure in our budget is interest payments. So if 25% of the debt comes from trying to protect that industry, 25% of the interest on that debt, which would be to the tune of approximately $250,000 each year, is money thrown out the window because government made that decision in the past. So why will not this government today look at that? Or will history repeat itself? Why not? Why doesn't government look today at what happened in the past and say, we need to do something about our operations to try to make it so that we are living within our means, that we have balanced budgets, and that we start to make government smaller, so that Nova Scotians have more so the government, and I'm trying to help the government with this suggestion, so the government has more free cash flow to spend on the priorities of Nova Scotians. Because I can tell you, Mr. Chair, if I was in government today, that's what I would be doing, and I would be much happier going to the polls and asking for Nova Scotian support if I was coming to them with resources freed up for their priorities instead of money being spent on keeping government big and eliminating the ability of government to become more nimble, eliminating the ability of government to have less money spent on interest payments. I'd be much happier going to the public saying, I did something about that. I didn't stand there and complain. I stood there. I made tough decisions. And I rediverted money away from interest and debt to Nova Scotians' priorities. But we haven't seen any mark of that effort yet. Nothing significant. And you know, if we did see government doing that, we wouldn't see the organized labor in this province as quiet as they are. Because if government was trying to address this, and organized labor would be doing their job, representing their members. Because I'm not saying any of this stuff is pretty, I'm not saying it's stuff that we enjoy doing, but Mr. Chair, it's about priorities. And with Bill 100, it's the same. If we are giving, I'm speaking about job security in this case. I'm speaking about Bill 100. If we're constricting government's ability to be able to control its costs, then well, we're not really going to be doing anything to until we start focusing on that. We're not going to see meaningful change in this province. So. And we're going to need everybody to pull together. We're going to need organized labor to support government in this. We're going to need political leaders, obviously. We're going to need the people in this chamber to make these decisions and to help the government of the day with these decisions. Everybody is going to have to pitch in. We're going to have, you know, entrepreneurs. One might say that entrepreneurs are pitching in already, Mr. Chair, when they're dealing with a province that has high taxes, that limits the amount of money in people's pockets to spend money in our province. But we need other people to make sacrifices, because we need to all be pulling the cart in this province. If we don't, what happens? Well, there's other people today that are making sacrifices. These students in the schools who are going to have to endure budget reductions through their school boards, they're going to be chipping in, Mr. Chair. They're going to be chipping in for these concessions for job security. You know, and that's kind of sad, but I'm sure that they'll find a way. But why aren't we moving in a direction where perhaps future generations of children don't have to make such sacrifices? And it's all about decisions, Mr. Chair. It's all about priorities. And that is why I have difficulty supporting Bill 100, because of these clauses that create the uncertainty and that could cause government to have difficulty controlling its costs. We need people to step up to the plate, Mr. Chair. And I'm doing what I can today by expressing my feelings about it. And I'm hoping that, that people are listening. And because doing something now makes life a lot easier in the future. It's no different than if you've got money. And I say money, Mr. Chair, because people like money, and it might help people to understand the value of this. You know, if you've got money put aside today and it's growing, you're getting interest and dividends, whoever you have it invested, that money is working for you. You're not even doing a thing. Your money is working for you. And someday in the future, you're going to be rewarded with that. But in government, if we look at it in that same example, if our costs are out of control and we're not doing something about it today, they start to get away in us, and it compounds. And if the government made a 2% cut, say last year, found 2% savings, well, that's 2% less savings they'd have to find this year. And perhaps if they found it in the right places, the system would adapt. Maybe people would leave government, but maybe they'd be finding jobs this year in a private sector that wasn't having to deal with a 2% HST increase. It's all about decisions, Mr. Chair. And the point I want to make is that doing something today has a profound difference tomorrow. Because even if you're making small percent changes today, you're going to have big changes, big results tomorrow, because the effort compounds. Much like when you save, you make a couple of percent this year. If you're making a couple of percent next year, well, you're making it not only on the money that you saved originally, but also on the money you've just earned, that 2% you've just earned. But the same is true with expenses. So, so, Mr. Chair, I would ask this government to step up to the plate and to start looking at measures to control costs and reconsider Bill 100. And Mr. Chair, you know, if we look at the past, which this government often tries to remind us of, you know, if we look at governments have tried to grapple in the past, and you know, there's always a sense that you know, in government, one of the challenges that government has, Mr. Chair, is that unlike the private sector, it's not motivated by profit. And there's certainly merit to that. If we have people working in a hospital, we don't want somebody scrimping on supplies, because if it's going to affect somebody's health, we don't want that. But there's certainly areas in government that, you know, I guess probably the best quote I could use would be, it doesn't matter. Because if you're not motivated by profit, sometimes it just doesn't matter. And we talk about corporate culture. I remember learning in university about corporate culture, and I thought, you know, it didn't have a lot of interest for me at the time. I thought it was some kind of new management theory, and I didn't place a lot of credence in it. But, you know, since I've left university, I realized the significance of corporate culture. And if we have a culture in government that it just doesn't matter about controlling costs, that may be for good reason, because people in government are not motivated to generate profit. And of course, we see sometimes there's a notion we got to spend the budget, because if you don't spend it, the next year you'll be asked, why didn't you spend it? And the logic might be, well, you didn't spend 15% of your budget last year, so surely you can do without that 15% this year. So there's a motivation there, Mr. Chair, for government to spend what's there. And you know, this is something we have to change in government. And if we look at Bill 100, if we look at services that could be, perhaps government could relieve itself of and maybe save some money on, well, that private sector might be able to find savings, because the people working in that organization may work in a completely different corporate culture, one where they value the need to optimize resources and, by extension, if it's contracted out for government, optimize taxpayers' resources, so the taxpayer gets to enjoy another service from government. Instead, money is saved. If this Bill 100 handicaps us, or handcuffs us rather, from being able to do that, Mr. Chair, I have difficulty supporting it. And because there's great value if we can have services placed with an organization with a corporate culture that can get the job done and save us some money. So maybe we can balance the budget, Mr. Chair. Maybe we can start to look at reducing that number 4 expenditure line in the budget, which is interest expense, which adds no value for Nova Scotians. So, Mr. Chair, I could continue, but I think I only have about 2 minutes left. And perhaps instead of continuing at this point in time, I will save some of these remarks for a further time in this House when I have the opportunity and the privilege to speak on this matter again. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Will now recognize the honourable member for Cape Breton South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to offer a few comments on Bill 100. I promise not to trespass on the time of the House, but I'll do my best to be as brief as possible. Maybe something short of an hour. But anyway, the reason I am on my feet is that this bill started out, I think, with good intentions. The bill started out as a bill to combine a number of acts respecting labor in this province. And at first blush, the bill seemed to be a very good bill that was widely consulted in order to change the bill itself. And it would have amalgamated the Corrections Act, the Labor Standards Code, and I have all these bills in front of me here, the Occupational Health and Safety Act, the Highway Workers Collective Bargaining Act, and all of these bills in and of themselves needed to be brought to one particular bill to deal with labor issues in this province, and the intention was very good, I think, in doing that. However, Mr. Speaker, this government was supposed to be a government, came to office with great expectations in the province. It was there's no question at the polls the last time there was an attitude or an air in the province that, look, we have to start over again. We have to do something new. We have to try this new government on, and perhaps they will be the government for all of Nova Scotia and Nova Scotians. And sadly, though, we've learned that this particular government has not been adhering to those principles in Bill 100 for sure, and in some other things that we've witnessed here in the past number of months since this great experiment in Nova Scotia took place about 17 or 18 months ago now. And again, you know, it's supposed to be a government for all Nova Scotians. Well, when the first thing that happened here with Bill 100, Mr. Speaker, is that Bill 100 was widely consulted about one part of the bill, and then the Minister of Labour introduced the bill, had a press briefing on it, and lo and behold, we find out that there was much more in that bill, Mr. Speaker, than an amalgamation of a number of boards. And it's those other clauses in the bill that we're concerned about because they were not consulted. The people of Nova Scotia were not consulted on anything else in that bill except the bringing together of a number of labor statutes. And as I said, in and of themselves, that was a good move by this government, probably long overdue. But one of the things that they promised and then dropped, and I suspect that that was part of the wish list of the people who are so anxious to get this bill through without major alterations, was that to change the title to the Labour and Employment Board. They couldn't even keep that together. It's now just the Labour Board, you know, when the bill went forward, and which would suggest that it's a bill for labor only in this province. And if you look through the bill, you'll find there are a number of provisions in this bill that would suggest that that's exactly the case. And what we have now come to believe, even more strongly than we did before, that this is nothing more than payback time. Payback time from the last election to the big unions who supported the NDP in the last election. Not the union rank and file, but the big union leadership in this province. And I don't have to start spelling out who they are. Everybody knows who they are in this province. They know who they are and they know what their agenda is. And their agenda was to make sure that this government toed the line with them, and this is what this government is doing. Payback time, and it's going to be very interesting. And I'm not naive enough to stand here and say this building is going to be stopped, or this bill is going to be stopped, because there's a majority government opposite there. And if this government wants this bill to go through in whatever context, it will go through. But it's going to be very interesting to see who the chairman of this new board is going to be and what the makeup of the board is going to be. I could throw some names out there. A couple of them might have been at law amendments the other day. But, you know, at least one, you know, the Rick Clark could probably be one that I would suggest that will probably be looking for a nice, safe sinecure as chairman of that board, or maybe Joan Jessom's getting tired of running the NSGEU and perhaps want to move to or Ray Larkin, you know, who I categorized as an NDP lawyer at the hearings the other day, and he didn't deny that. But what he didn't, what he also said was that everybody else in the room was wrong but him on his interpretation of the bill, you know. And if there's one thing I do know, that Mr. Larkin's been very successful from the unions over the years. You know, he'd be probably in the same category as some other very well-to-do socialists that I know in this province. You know, one of them sitting right in front of me over there, but there are others who have come before this House, and there's nothing more idealistic than a millionaire socialist, you know, and or one that's trying to be a millionaire, or somebody close to being a millionaire. And maybe the finance minister knows what I'm talking about. I don't know. But anyway, you know, he's certainly better off than I'll ever be. But I mean, the names that I've thrown out there's probably some others out there. But I would bet that none of the three that I mentioned are going to be too far from the pinnacles of power in running this operation once this bill goes through the House. I just want to, you know, we're going to do a sweepstake to see whether Rick gets it or whether Joan Jessom gets it or something. But one of those will be the chairman of that board. And Mr. Speaker, there are other sections of this bill that really bother me, and I think that people in Nova Scotia should realize what can happen here. You know, a secret ballot could be gone. A secret ballot, something we hold so dear in this province, could be gone, replaced by a card at the gate that you would sign, and by signing that card in public, or with your peers around you at the workplace, then that's an automatic signal that you want to be organized. Never mind a secret ballot. And, you know, you have to wonder why that provision is there. You have to wonder why in the year 2010 we've gone so far back now that intimidation is now becoming another byword in this province, or another tool to use to put people in line. In other words, if they want to organize somewhere, you're not going to get the opportunity to have a secret ballot to say whether you want to be in that bargaining unit or you don't. And that, to me, is a giant step backwards in the freedom of people in this province. Because intimidation is a great tool if you're looking to get people to keep people in line. And when you're asked to sign cards, and that by signing that card, it donates that you're agreeing to a union, or you're agreeing to it without a further vote, is something that concerns me and concerns many Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, I have in front of me a letter, and this letter's been quoted here before and tabled before, but I think it's a serious letter. It's an open letter to the Premier, you know, and it's an open letter that's signed by many people and many small businesses in this province and larger business: Atlantic Building Supply Dealers, Atlantic Recreational Dealers Association, Canadian Council of Grocery Distributors, Canadian Federation of Independent Business, Canadian Restaurant and Food Services, Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters, Construction Association of Nova Scotia, Halifax Chamber of Commerce, Halifax Dartmouth Automobile Dealers Association, Merit Contractors, who made a presentation to law amendments on this issue, Nova Scotia Automobile Dealers Association, Nova Scotia Chamber of Commerce, Nova Scotia Home Builders Association, Office of Employer Advisor, Onshore Offshore Technologies Association of Nova Scotia, the Restaurant Association of Nova Scotia, the Retail Council of Canada, and Nova Scotia Natural Gas Association. Those are the ones that are concerned about it to date. But as this bill moves through the House, I'm sure we're going to be hearing from some other businesses, small and medium size, in this province. You have to ask yourself, Mr. Speaker, what is the hurry in this bill? What is the hurry to get it through the House, rather than putting the brakes on and saying we have to consult with Nova Scotians on the other aspects of this bill that have been mentioned at law amendments, mentioned second reading, and now mentioned here in committee of the whole House? Businesses were not consulted on many parts of this bill, and that, to me, speaks volumes about where this government wants to go. They've rejected any consultation practice with, or practices, or any consultation periods with small businesses in this province, and small business under this government now, I think, has a reason to worry, because they've been sidetracked. they have a reason to worry, because is there another agenda here in the hurry to get this bill through? Is the finance minister and others putting together some kind of a package that would see the government divesting itself of some public agencies this spring to help him with his budget? And by virtue of doing that, Mr. Speaker, the employees under this bill would then be able to go with the department. But worse than that, the private sector that inherits or takes on this responsibility would have to take the employees with all their government benefits with them. And it's no wonder the government is concerned about that in the province. They don't get to say who's going to work for them. And I would hope that we don't see this happening this spring, but I'm afraid we're going to see it happen. It's a way for the government to do two things: to get rid of some of their departments that they might want us to split off to the private sector, and at the same time protecting the public sector workers that belong to those operations. That's fine for the public sector workers. I would rather see them ensure that the public sector workers would stay in the public sector, in other jobs, if the government's going to divest itself of some of their responsibilities, rather than telling a small business in this province they have to take those employees, perhaps at the expense of some of their employees they already had. So it's certainly going to split. It's going to split the collective camps in Nova Scotia who are out there trying to make a living. There's no question about that. But I think that the consultation thing could have, I think, allayed a lot of these fears if it was allowed to happen. But this government is using its legislative majority to ram this bill through. They know, and we know, that we can only hold this bill up for so long, and then you'll see closure motions on third reading. You may even see it before this committee rises, but you'll see the government, when they get tired of hearing from us, will invoke their majority and have their way with the people of Nova Scotia on this bill, and that's exactly what's going to happen here. And Mr. Speaker, I want to remind the members opposite that all of those members on the government side are not responsible for government policy. Only the cabinet is. All these members who are opposite, who represent constituencies in Nova Scotia, are sent here to do the work of their constituents. Mind you, there's a couple of wannabe cabinet ministers over there that are hoping that they will be part of the decision-making process in this province. But as we speak today, they are not. Only the cabinet is, and they have to realize that even you can draw a fine line between allowing some of the backbenchers to go out and announce government projects, which really is not the purview of a non-cabinet minister, but they're trying to spread around the goodwill, so they're allowing backbenchers to go out and make some government announcements where, in fact, the cabinet ministers should be doing that themselves. But we've heard, yes, and we've heard about some of the backbenchers that are out there freely talking about the day when they'll be in cabinet, you know, and then they can become responsible. You know, right now, Mr. Speaker, they're like the handle on the pot. They're there, but they're not in it. You know, but I guess what I would say is that they had better pay attention to their constituencies. Yep. They had better pay attention to their constituencies.
The chatter is getting a little high. I would ask that the members who have chattered to take it outside the chamber. The honourable member for Cape Breton South has the floor.
Because each and every one of those members, Mr. Speaker, thank you, Mr. Speaker, each and every one of those members has small business interests in their constituencies. They have people who are concerned about this bill. And they had better be paying attention to them rather than towing the line on government policy here. Because it's not government policy that's going to get the backbenchers elected in the next election. That's for sure. What it's going to be is how good you are in looking after the people that sent you here and how much you pay attention to what's going on in your constituents. And I'm going to tell you, if you don't think that's a problem, there are only 3 members in this House in the class of '93. They're all Liberals, by the way. And they all sit over here. There's nobody over there who's been here since '93. And I can tell you, I see many faces change in this House after every election. And if everybody over there thinks they're going to be here after the next election, if they keep towing the government line like they're doing, instead of looking after the interests of the people they represent, they're not going to be here. And if anybody over there thinks that this is a rite of passage to retirement, think again, because it's not a rite of passage to retirement. And at some time in the next few months, I'm going to start singling out people who I think will be back. And over the years, I've taken that on as a duty of mine to let Nova Scotians who I think are doing a good job in their constituency and those who aren't.
Order, please. Order.
All I can tell you is that
The honourable member for Cape Breton South has the floor.
I've gone through 11 elections, Mr. Speaker, 11 elections in my political career, and I didn't get elected each time by not looking after my constituents. If you want a short tenure here in the House, start paying more attention to bills like this and less attention to the needs and wants of your constituents. Just a little helpful advice. And you know what? And the backbenchers, cabinet ministers are tied to this bill. There's no question. If they don't like this bill, they should get out of the cabinet and let the Premier and the Minister of Labour know. But the backbenchers are not tied to this bill. They may think they're tied to this bill, and they may think by towing the government party line on this particular bill that they're going to get rewarded. Well, they may get rewarded from the gentleman opposite me there, but they're not going to get rewarded from their constituents unless they're prepared to go back and tell their constituents why they supported or didn't support a particular bill. So I just leave that with you for reflection on that particular point, that this place has changed an awful lot. There are not going to be any more 15-year people, new people, sitting around this table. I can tell you that right now, you know. And I think that if you want longevity in here, start listening to your constituents. Just don't sit over there and clap when one of the ministers says something because you may be noticed, or jump up and cheer. I remember last week there, the finance minister was going on about something. I don't know what it was, but I wasn't paying much attention. But in other words, when he sat down, he got a standing O from two of the people over there, you know. And there was a third halfway up before the other two sat down. So you know, I don't know what he was talking about, but whatever it was, it got two people excited over there anyway. But that was. But and I digress for a moment, but I'll be back to the bill here. You know, there's no question in my mind that this bill has everything to do with the payback in the last election. Everything to do with it. Because if it didn't have that connection with big labor in the last election, then we wouldn't be standing here today discussing Bill 100. Every single small business in this province, or every business that employs people, particularly non-union shops in this province, and there are over 70% of the people working in this province are not in unions. They have a reason to worry with this bill, a reason to worry with this bill. Now, some people over there who think they're going to be here forever will dismiss that. They'll say, he doesn't know what he's talking about and everything. But I can tell you this, that I came into a government in 1993. We had 42 members out of the 52 in this House, 42 members. 7 years later, we were struggling with a minority government of 19, 19, and 14. Because some of our people didn't listen to their constituents. There's no question. They just didn't get defeated because somebody wanted somebody else. They got defeated because they weren't listening to their constituents. And if you look at the pictures on the walls throughout this hallowed building we're in, you'll see a lot of faces there that were good performers in the House here, but not so good performers in their constituency. And when that happens, they may be here, but they won't be here for a long period of time. And I say that because the small business people, the people who are concerned with Bill 100, Mr. Speaker or Mr. Chairman, are going to be questioning the backbenchers on this bill. As more of the implications of this bill get out in the public, they're going to be questioning where you stand on this bill and where you stand on other bills and where you stand on representing your people versus towing the party line and supporting your cabinet. And I say that with all honesty, that the cabinet ministers don't have a choice here. This is government policy, and having served in the Executive Council and having been in a number of portfolios in the past, I can tell you that if you don't like the government policy that you're objecting to, then you get out of the cabinet, and you say your reasons why. But backbenchers, as I said before, are not encumbered by that. Backbenchers are not encumbered by government policy. Rather, backbenchers are bound, are morally bound, and they're elected to serve the constituents that sent them here. So a piece of advice would be for the backbenchers to stop thinking about getting cabinet and start thinking about looking after your constituents and some of the people who are concerned about this bill. And some of them are concerned about this bill, and I suggest that you should seek them out and have a discussion with them on this bill. There are a number of provisions in this bill that are that I can't understand why the government would not at least consult with sections of the economy here in Nova Scotia, just to get some feedback, because they didn't do any of that. But what was most egregious about this whole thing is that the Labour Minister said it was only a housekeeping bill. The Labour Minister said it was only a housekeeping bill. You know, for a person to lose the right for a secret ballot in this province is a housekeeping matter? You know, come on, this is the year 2010. It's not the year 1850. You know, and I mean, you know, let's not bring this place back to some kind of a backwater where people are told they're going to be in a union and they can't work unless they are. You know, whatever happened to the situation where non-union and union could work together, that was coming along very nicely in Nova Scotia until this government came to power. This government is one-sided. And it's not even one-sided for the rank and file, because it's not the rank and file of the unions that are the problem here. It's the leadership of the unions who are now flexing their collective muscles and saying, hey, we're running things now. We got you guys in there, and we're running things now. And I just can't wait to the makeup of this board till we see who we've got running this board when it comes. I just, you know, as a matter of fact, we have a poll going in our caucus about that. And I think the predictions, the short list, I think is really short. But even lawyers that we've talked to, you know, lawyers are notorious for having a different opinion on issues. I see the chief clerk smiling there, but he knows what I mean. If two lawyers get in the room, you'll never get an agreement on anything. But the problem is that even Labour lawyers have some difficulty with this bill, except Ray Larkin, of course. Of course, he's the only opinion that counts. He's the new chair. You know, and Ray probably, he's the new probably be, yeah. But I mean, most lawyers that we've talked to have difference of opinion on this particular bill, and some of them, Mr. Chairman, are quite varied in their interpretation of what's in this bill. That alone, that particular situation alone, Mr. Chairman, would suggest that this bill should be held up for further consultation with Nova Scotians. But it's not going to be, because this is payback time. This was a promise this government made and tried to sneak it in under a housekeeping bill. Tried to sneak it in, and the minister says, oh, this is only housekeeping. We're changing the name, and we're consolidating 6 Labour boards in this province. That's all we're doing. Sounds fun. And that was no problem on this side of the House with that. No problem at all. But it's when we started to drill down on the bill and started to look at it and started to get some of our legal expertise on it and some of the, both on the labor and management side, that we started to realize that this bill could have a devastating effect on worker relations in this province in the future. It unfairly makes employers pay here, I think, small business employers, when they might not be able to run a shop, for example, if they're told that they have to employ certain people with certain benefits that are mostly consistent with work in the public sector, and I don't have a problem with that. and the people who work in the public sector that this government, this finance minister, may be getting ready to jettison to the private sector this spring, they're going to have the right then to go to a private employer who might bid for a contract, privatization contract, which it'll be interesting to see when the government starts to get rid of some things that when they were in opposition, it would be terrible to even suggest to them that something would be privatized. But I think that they're going down the road. But before they go down that road, they want to make sure that they get rid of the employees at the same time, so they won't have to keep them in the public sector. They can get them to the private sector with the same benefits they had in the public sector. So they achieve, yeah, they offload them, you know. But you know, that works good in the short short term for the government and perhaps even for the employees. But in the long term, once the government divests themselves of these employees, then the small business has the responsibility to look after them. And when that happens, guess what will happen next? The small business concerned, or the person doing construction work, or the person doing something that normally was done before by the government, will decide that it's too expensive for him and he might go out of business. What happens to these employees then? The employees that the government let go? They're nowhere. You know, and if I was an employee of the public sector in this province right now, I'd rather stay with the public sector and not go to some private business with my benefits, because that's not as secure down the road. That's only as secure as if that business is making $1. And with those added costs, they may not be able to do that, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, that's only one of the things that concerns people that I've talked to. Are they trying, Mr. Chairman, to come closer to his word, the finance minister's words now, back to balance, even though that's kind of hard to get any interest in going down the road with that phrase, because since they came to power, they're almost $2 billion in long-term debt. They haven't even been here 2 years yet, Mr. Chairman. I don't know what the debt's going to be by the time we go to the polls again, but I suggest to you it'll probably be a debt of historic proportions in this province, because it doesn't seem to be coming down, it's going up. As a matter of fact, it's gone up $2 billion. And the line item now, to pay that debt, the line item now is probably $1 billion or more. Just money that's just eaten up like that, burnt, gone to the people who lend money to the province. That doesn't show any signs of slowing down. The deficit that the finance minister talks about going back to balance, is that going to be achieved by divesting the public sector, or by decimating, I should say, some of the services that are provided now by the public sector to the private sector under the guise of we're going to look after the employees when we do that? Is that what the game is here next spring? I think so. You know, I'll wait and see. I'll reserve judgment on it till I'm proven otherwise. But I can tell you, it looks awfully funny to me that this has to be hurried through the House, because the government's getting ready to make some wholesale changes in how we deliver services in this province. And that would be unfortunate, Mr. Chairman, because the employees are only guaranteed for a short period of time if they have to go to the private sector from their public sector jobs. And I would hate to see anybody lose a public sector job in this province. But if they do go, by virtue of the service they're performing going to the private sector, how long are they going to be protected with that business? Successor rights will come into play, but if the business goes out of business, if it just shuts down and says, I can't compete anymore, this business in Nova Scotia, can't compete. So when that happens, what happens to those employees then? Is the government going to take them back to the public sector? I don't think so. So what happens to them? If I was a provincial government employee, I'd be concerned about this. Because I work for the public sector, they'll be telling me, and I want to stay in the public sector. And I want to retain my benefits in the public sector, not retain my benefits in private industry. Because the government wants to divest itself of certain services that the public is now delivering. I would have thought, and you know what, Mr. Chairman, not would have thought, I would guarantee you that if the NDP were on this side of the House debating this bill, you know, I mean, we would be standing here with hordes of people outside on both ends of this building. They'd be up in the rafters here. They'd be hollering at us, and the NDP in opposition would have had everybody in a frenzy. But now that they're doing it, I see the wannabe cabinet minister over there is jumping into the fray here. But anyway, I don't think he has much of a hope. But anyway, it's you know, all I'm saying is that if I was a public sector employee, I would have thought that for all time, I'm going to be safe in the public sector because I now have a socialist government, an NDP socialist government in charge. And they look after workers. They look after workers. That's what these people thought when they elected this government. Now we're seeing legislation that could see them go, along with the job they're performing in the public sector, to the private sector. Because this finance minister and that premier wants to get back to balance. Well, how do you do that? Well, you get rid of some departments. You know, you sell them off. Sell them off to the private sector. But guess what? And I'm sure there are some public employees watching this or listening to it. I'm sure that they're concerned about, am I going? Am I going to the private sector? Sure, this legislation will give them a guaranteed job and successor rights. The business that takes over will have to take the employees too. But for how long? And these people now have falling out from under the protection of the public service. And that should concern all Nova Scotians who work for the public service. But you know, for the first 17 months of this government or so, I think time is moving on. It's probably 18 months now, is it? Or 17 months, whatever. I think up until now, there's been a quiet consensus among public employees that, hey, you know, I think we might be a bit safe here now because we've got a government that was brought to office on looking after us. No, they're wrong. This government was brought to office by the leaders of the unions in this province, not by the rank and file workers, or not, Mr. Chairman, by the non-unionized employees. Some of them, yes, wanted a change in Nova Scotia for various other reasons. And they opted to go with this great experiment, you know, in the last election. Well, we're going to just see how this experiment unfolds, because they should know that everybody over there is not a socialist. They may be disguising themselves as socialists until they got here, but they're certainly not socialists, you know. And as I said at the outset, of my few remarks today that you know, you are beware of very wealthy socialists. You know, we've had them in this province in the past, and I dare say we've got a couple opposite me sitting here these days. You know, it's, you know, I don't like to single people out, but right across from me there is a man that I would think is very well off. But I mean, when do you lose your perspective when you're dealing with people, Mr. Chairman? When do you lose your perspective? This government was supposed to look after the disadvantaged in this province. Supposed to be looking after the people who are marginal in their incomes in this province. You don't hear a word from the government on that. They've abandoned. They've
Order, please.
Totally abandoned ship.
Order.
The poor in this province. They don't even talk about them anymore. They've abandoned ship.
If the honourable members would like to carry on a conversation, I would ask them to take it outside the chamber. Honourable, the member for Cape Breton South has the floor.
Well, you know, during debate in committee of the whole House, a member can get up and down anytime they want, as long as it's within the 20 hours. So if that member wants to get up and take a few moments, you know, I'll cede the floor to him. But if he doesn't, you know. But maybe Lynn, you know, maybe the member from, where's he from? What? Sidnall, Halifax Sidnall, yeah, you know, maybe he'd like to get up. But anyway, I digress, Mr. Chairman. I digress. What I was saying is that that socialist experiment over there abandoned ship with the poor of this province. That's the first thing they did. That's the first thing they did. They don't pay any attention to it, yet when they were over here, they railed about the lot of the poor in this province, the need for better housing, the need for better social service programs. You don't hear them talk about that anymore. You don't hear, I mean, this is like, it's like it didn't exist in this province. The other day, the statistics come out in my area in Cape Breton, I believe it's 16% unemployment. Atrocious. Atrocious, unacceptable. What's the government doing about employment in Cape Breton? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The only employment that went in down there in the past number of years was the call centers. You know, I mean, we've got so many call centers down there, they must be talking to each other, Mr. Chairman, because, you know, and they're all $10, $11 an hour. That does not make an economy. It helps, but you need steady, long-term planning jobs, and that's not happening in my area, Cape Breton. What's the government saying about it? Nothing. Government does not even have an economic agenda for Cape Breton that I'm aware of. And make no mistake about it, the government jumped on board with the harbour dredging. I'll give them that. But that was something that I would have done if I was in government. I would have got on the plate before the feds did and then pushed the button with them. You guys did that. But one word spoiled that adventure, was the word contingent. The government didn't say, we're going in there and do something. The government says, we'll put money there contingent on whether the feds do. And you have to remember that even if this project does come to fruition and we do dredge the harbour, then that's only the start. There are no jobs with that except the short-term construction jobs. It's then to try to go out and generate a book of business so we can get some long-term stability into our economy, by dealing in post-Panamax ships, by shipping coal out of the island, shipping other goods to European markets, Asian markets, out of the Port of Sydney. That's the long-term dream. But has the government put together any kind of a strategy to go look for a book of business for that port? Not to my knowledge. If they have, I haven't witnessed it. You know, the Minister of Development might want to have a cup of tea with somebody down there, you know, and talk about what can we do to try to assure that you get a book of business, because I think that harbour is going to be dredged. I have a feeling that that'll be the announcement. The last piece of that puzzle will be put in place in a couple of weeks' time. But that's only the start, not the finish. That's only the start and not the finish. And I don't care who gets it as long as we get it. But the bottom line is, it's a bill like this that again is going to worry people in my area about what the future holds, both for their businesses and also for the people who, the few people that still work in the public sector in Cape Breton. There's not many left down there, but anyway, Mr. Speaker, it may eliminate contracting out options for government. We don't know, and government's going to be deprived of flexibility in delivery of services to Nova Scotians at a time when the government faces great fiscal challenges. And the one thing the finance minister said that was correct, that we are facing tremendous challenges in Nova Scotia. Here we have a population in this province of less than 1 million people, and we're heading for $14 billion in debt in the long term, which is itself is atrocious. And also, we're not able to provide the basic services. So what is the finance minister? Somebody, and I hope it was him alone, because I wouldn't like to think there was somebody else that was as Machiavellian as he is, you know, to try to hoodwink Nova Scotians into thinking that we're going to go back to balance in a short period of time without decimating the public service. But what does he do? This bill ends up in front of us, Bill 100. That's the bill that's going to enable the government to divest themselves of some important public services this year to the private sector, on a bid process probably. But along with that process comes the need to take the employees, because government's not going to keep the employees if they divest the department. You know, they're not going to keep the employees. What's that? So So the bottom line here is that public service employees have a reason to be worried under this government. And you know what? As I said earlier, there's no reason why the government of Nova Scotia couldn't hold this bill until they had wide consultation with what they're going to divest, who they're going to divest it to, and what employees are going to take over or get taken over. Was that 5 points? Now the situation here in this province, I think, is grim to say the least, and I think that this government is grappling with ways to try to do something about it. But when you hear the laughing the laughable comments of the Premier about the panacea that this line coming through Nova Scotia is going to give the employment opportunities to our people. The line comes, it's going to, if it ever comes, it's going to come ashore in Lingan in Cape Breton. Then it's going to come up through the province and go off to where the money is. I don't know where the thousands of jobs that he was talking about is going to come from under that particular project. You know, that's just another, but you know what? That statement was holding out hope to people in Nova Scotia. And I hope that he's right. But you know what? That statement was made just right around the time that the same CRA poll he's been talking about come out. Yeah.